Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Um, Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the fifth day of the 10-day workshop on research methods in international relations and related social sciences, organized by Jadavpur Association of International Relations. Our speaker for today is Professor Amitesh Mukhopadhyay. Welcome to the session, sir. It is a
Thank
great
you.
privilege to have you with us. Professor Mukhopadhyay currently teaches at the Department of Sociology, Jadavpur University. He has received his MA and MPhil from Jawaharlal Nehru University and done his PhD from University of London. Apart from a wide range of publications in academic journals and edited volumes, Professor Mukhopadhyay has also published several books. Living with Disaster is one among them, which focuses on communities and development in Indian Sundarbans. It was published in 2016 by Cambridge University Press. His research interest basically includes narrative of governance and development, identity politics and institutional histories of science, and knowledge making in South Asian context. Today's lecture focuses on ethnography, which is of absolute importance in the field of research for giving the researcher direct access to the culture and practices of a group. So, without any further delay, I would request Professor Amitesh Mukhopadhyay to take over the session here onwards. Over to you, sir.
Well, thank you. Am I audible? Can you hear
Yes, sir.
me?
You're sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. Just a quick uh, query about this is the participants for this workshop. Um, Mostly, I would assume that they are from social sciences or humanities. Um, But what level are you all at in the sense, is this a workshop for teachers or
Sir, we are at master's level. I am from master's level. There are people from the undergrads too, and definitely research scholars, sir.
okay? And mostly from subjects such as international relations and
Sir, mostly from political science, international relations, as far as I know.
okay, political science, international relations. Okay. Um, Initially, I thought, and that's what I gave as one of my proposed titles. Um, Thought that I would probably perhaps try and focus on um, historical sensibilities in methods of sociological research, but then Shivashish Chatterjee suggested and insisted that I'd speak on ethnography, and what I propose to do is to basically share with you this uh, try and outline basically try and outline the entire context for ethnographic research, um, because one of the things that social science methods or social science pursuit of methods should focus and perhaps accept as one of the very fundamental points is that none of what we discuss as methods, whether this relate to ethnography or to some other methods about which you might have had and I already have had your experience of people delivering their lectures, addresses on the different areas of method, because I happen to have and sort of have looked at that entire program, and there are various issues which came up probably on the entire question of method, and therefore I am going to speak about ethnography. But one thing I must make very clear is that none of what we discuss as methods uh, had developed as though they were meant to be developed only in the domain of the disciplines that we call social sciences or humanities. In other words, what I'm trying to suggest is, which is one of my first um, sort of important highlights which I want to flag, is that there is I mean, whenever you have a discussion on methods, whether it is um, survey, whether it is uh, uh, some of the very various elements of qualitative or quantitative research, the different aspects of it, uh, there's an air of value freedom, there's an air of value neutrality, there's an air of objectivity. Somehow we all find associated with this whole discussion and idea of method. And this is exactly what I want to flag as my first point, is that none of what we discuss as methods, whether they relate to sociology, they relate to politics, they relate to history, they relate to uh, economics, they relate to humanities such as literature, literary fields. Generally, they all have come up under conditions based on certain imperatives. These imperatives are not something that directly relate to the development progress of the disciplines as such. They might have had their origin elsewhere in connection with uh, things which are particularly relevant for certain institution making. And one important institution making was how you actually develop different apparatus of uh, ordering, classifying, and governing the physical and the non-physical properties of universe. If we trace some of the methods that you have already had your discussion, and if we look at some of these methods, then you would find that many of them have had their very specific origin in the European context at a particular juncture in history, when certain modalities of developing a renewed understanding of your surrounding and the universe had come very strongly and had been put forth uh, by certain institutionalities of um, institutionalities of state making, institution making. By institution making, I refer to both state making as well as different other facets of social life, which make it possible for us to you know, uh, uh, understand the kind of transformation and changes that are happening, largely because of the way in which European history had undergone some transformation. I'm not getting into all of that for the simple reason that those are things that you might have had already an understanding about what European Enlightenment is, what was basically the context for European Enlightenment, and what are the different institutional arrangements which became possible for all of us to be aware and familiar with. Uh, but there was a sense in which sudden transformations were happening. I mean, if you think of, just to give you, just by way of an example, if we could sort of remember the very important philosopher of enlightenment, because to whom we assign this particular term, the Immanuel Kant, in his 1784 lecture in Prussia, uh, where he uh, is somebody who's been reflecting on his time, and in reflecting on his time, he is trying to also make a sense of all that happened in Europe over centuries through different historical events, different historical moments, kind of a tumultuous history that Europe had gone through, whereby many of the assumptions on which European order um, pre Enlightenment was based came under serious scanner. And therefore, here is somebody who is, uh, you know, delivering a lecture in Prussia in 1784, and important that he is delivering at a time when many things that we had associated with the old order still not gone, they have not disappeared. In other words, still there's a Prussian monarchy, and Immanuel Kant, like many other, you have the classical music composers who had often been patronized by the king and the court, so on and so forth, and they this entirely, it is not a kind of impossibility that a philosopher would also be patronized by the current political order, which is kingly order, royalty, so on and so forth. But even then, someone way back in 1784 was trying to assign a character to the age after having had so much happen, on the political horizon, economic horizon, social cultural horizon, um, that he suggested that uh, if there's anything that we want to characterize this particular moment as, in other words, trying to sort of give a sense of what these historical developments, what message does it convey, then he suggested that perhaps it's not entirely out of place to call this a age of enlightenment, a kind of an age of enlightenment, meaning not in a sense of periodic kind of a implication that he had on his mind, but what he was trying to suggest that let's call this a kind of an enlightenment age where things would constantly be uh, you know uh, dawning on humans uh, in a manner in which he would find himself more and more prepared for it. And therefore, he decided to call this enlightenment and understand enlightenment as something of a man's freedom, as some kind of a release from his self incurred tutelages. Self incurred tutelages meaning that certain ways in which he was controlled, tutored, you know, uh, handheld in a particular way that even if he wanted, he could have perhaps, uh, taken off some of those diktats, some of those tutorships, but he chose not to, and therefore it is a time when historical sensibilities of the age, as it had unfolded on various registers, seems to suggest that they better, you know, be prepared for a freedom from something that they chose not to question all this while, and now that they should question. And therefore, it is a kind of a self-incurred tutelage. Self-incurred tutelage had constrained him, preventing him from doing many things. One of the things that Kant thought was of crucial significance, if one were to understand the centrality of what enlightenment was all about, that he said that it is the courage which he had lacked all this while, and now that he kind of wakes up out of a deep slumber to something where he needs to master this courage to question some of those who had held him almost, at ransom, uh, and that he was under their spell, and to cast the spell off. To be able to do that is a kind of an enlightenment. But what then can, what then can uh, lectures further in that very short lecture, which eventually got published in print, called What is Enlightenment? In other words, he was posing a question and was trying to provide an answer to it. Um, that in what follows in his lecture is that what are the different modalities through which this newfound sensibility of questioning those who had controlled him, tutored him, led him in a particular direction, and never allowed him to become independent, never allowed him to have a sense of adulthood in a kind of a metaphorical sense, that of course we are all dealing with adults, and Kant was also dealing with adults at that point in time. But there is a sense in which the adult has never become an adult, and it is enlightenment which has provided the kind of a condition whereby he could become an adult, right? And the way he had discussed the modalities of how he should become part of his journey to the adulthood is not something that, of course, it is individual who is at the center of this entire enlightenment as uh, a kind of newfound freedom. Uh, but the path to this enlightenment it will not be something that he would only traverse as and when he pleases, but he traverses through certain arrangements which are institutionally possible now, and therefore it is only now that those institutional arrangements enlarge only the spheres where individual, someone who is absolutely, on his own, had the courage, had reached the adulthood to basically follow his own rational faculties. These rational faculties are not something which is entirely kind of, something that out of the blue dawned on him, but these rational faculties are kind of inscribed onto the social order, inscribed in a manner in which the state will function in a particular way, the market will function in a particular way, the 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 kind of an, educational institution would function in a particular way, uh, um, family would function in a particular way, church would function in a particular way, In other words, that his ability to question, have the audacity to, you know, counter, challenge, all of these became possible not because he has only grown out of his slumber, but it is also the society has also been able to structure, you know, its various institutional folds in a manner in which they would automatically flourish certain ways of doing things, certain ways of acting, certain ways of performing, certain ways of deciding, certain ways in which he would constantly be aware of what he was doing, and thereby not only enlarging uh, his freedom, but enlarging his freedom as it is a derivative derived from a wider institutional sphere where reason has come to occupy a position of immense importance. So if state is functioning in a particular way, there is enormous rationality which gets inscribed into its institutional fold. If market is functioning in a particular way, then it gets inscribed in a particular way into its institutional fold, and which is why whatever he would do would automatically be informed by certain institutional sphere of reason already flourishing, enlarging, expanding, and thereby allowing him to be much freer than what he used to be. I simply bring in Kant uh, only to suggest that this whole idea of what is going to be the pursuit of different sciences, and particularly for our concern, social sciences, the modalities are chalked out in the larger social sphere of institutional order, where there are certain imperatives which are at work, there are certain necessities which are at work, that there has arisen a need to do things in a manner in which it becomes something which is different from the earlier order. There has to be a way in which things have to be carried out to its logical fruition. Therefore, it what it achieves is something symptomatically different from what order that obtained prior to this kind of an enlightened order. So, therefore, what I'm trying to suggest is that the ways of doing things from which our different knowledge pursuits for different sciences had grown, we must not forget that the modalities had actually arisen elsewhere. It is from there that the modalities have come and become part of the disciplinary engagements, and informed in very many ways that such disciplinary engagements could proceed along a particular path which is constantly sort of, you know, authenticated, validated by a number of uh, you know by a number of yardsticks, by a number of validation points which indicate that what we are doing, if we are doing politics, that the method that we are doing to understand politics is adequately scientific, objective, so on and so forth. And therefore, what we do in politics is not something which is absolutely a figment of one's imagination, but something which is absolutely sort of rooted into the rigor and methods of research. But the question of rigor and the method has already been, you know, encountered elsewhere as something much more pragmatic, a larger imperative of ordering, governing, institutional fold. And it is to this that I want to link this entire discussion of ethnography. Because I don't know if you might have already had some idea about what ethnography is all about, but one of the things that very often we all try and sort of come to a sense of an agreement is that ethnography is a kind of a research, a which comes under qualitative method. Let's you know sort of no, do the checklist that it comes under qualitative method. It is a kind of research where um, people go and study a particular community um, on a long-term basis. Um, it is a kind of a study where people often become somewhat uh, part of the community life that they were studying, and then from all of this arises something which is an account of that particular community life, undertaken entirely by the anthropologist, because ethnography very often is invoked with reference to anthropology as a discipline. Not that by this I'm suggesting that a political scientist, if we could still use that term, but I think political science is kind of an obsolete term. More and more people are should use the term that political studies or politics. So therefore, people who are doing politics and political studies, of course, can do ethnography in as much as an anthropologist can do. But primarily, whenever we talk about ethnography and the kind of contour that we already draw about what ethnography essentially characteristically is all about, then in many ways it comes closer to the discipline of anthropology, to something of a qualitative research, as if there are less numbers to deal with in this particular field, as opposed to field where you know those who do politics, they often do a lot of uh, voting behavior study, electoral study, and where there are a lot of numbers, percentages, these, that, and the others that they handle, and therefore there is an almost a tacit assumption that they are largely into the domain of the quantitative research, and hence anthropology somewhat stands out as being a practice which is largely has to do with quality as opposed to quantity, because there are lesser numbers, lesser percentages, lesser numericals which are involved. Given this as the uh, larger understanding of ethnography, um, what is important for us is to basically follow from what I have just mentioned, the point number one, that my first um, point that I want to highlight, that much of what we do as methods, whether it is electoral study and a lot of percentages, or whether it is a qualitative study where there are no percentages, no mathematical calculations, no quants, nothing of that sort, they both evolve elsewhere. They both happen elsewhere and as part of something where um, many other considerations, apart from absolutely doing knowledge for knowledge sake, uh, is involved. And hence I question the second assumption that methods are necessarily value free, because if we are talking about methods originating, evolving as part of certain institutional arrangements within which modern society functions, enlarges its scope of activities, then it has to do with a lot of, you know, a lot of uh, initiatives and endeavor which have to do with power. By power, I mean not in the old political sociological sense of someone having power and someone doesn't have power. Not in that sense, but power as something which helps us understand are how things are knowable, decipherable, understandable, intelligible, so on and so forth. Right? In other words, if we are to know how an enlightened human functions, then one has to also understand the what sort of an institutional arrangement that one puts in place that is somewhat intelligible, and it corresponds to the way in which the enlightened individual would function. So therefore it would be a kind of a correspondence absolutely between the two, in a manner in which it enlarges the scope of uh, rationality and freedom both. And therefore, my second point that I wanted to highlight was that none of what we do, whether we are doing uh, quantitative electoral studies or we are doing qualitative ethnography, none of this had ever originated in political science or politics or in anthropology either. They all evolved as manifestations of new modalities of power, and power being a very important instrument in classifying, ordering, and making sense of the institutional world that we have put in place. And one of the things that becomes very important is governance and state making, without which the modern the repertoire of modern power would be absolutely impossible to understand. By repertoire of modern power, I mean that the various pathways through which modern power expresses itself as the very important condition within which they try and provide solution to many problems, many questions, many issues, right? Because one of the things that became almost uh, something that Europe had to reckon uh, with its political, social, historical transformations was the rise of the nation state, something that you all had done in your politics studies. The rise of the nation state and the gradual, you know, the kind of dismantling of the earlier empire into several nation states on the basis of what Benedict Anderson in his famous book Imagine Communities had already outlined the linguistic modalities of nation building, and therefore the new nation had to contend with a very significant question of population. And therefore, how does one understand and make sense of this population is when uh, the modalities of empirical study, once again we use this term empirical very uh, almost as if we never bothered to even explain that something that we have almost understood as given as far as all these different social sciences are concerned is that empirical is one of the very important objectives of these sciences. But this entire concern with empirical had actually evolved with this entire shift from the subjects of the princely states, subjects of the royalties, subjects of the empires, to a certain sense in which population become very important phenomenon to contend with, because you have the nations and the boundaries meaning there are geographical limits, but at the same time boundaries are very important markers, and also boundaries are not as if they are hermetically sealed. There are movements across boundaries, and therefore your population constantly becoming, heterogeneous. And therefore, just by way of an example, I bring in this question of population is to suggest that it is only to govern this kind of a population which you are not quite familiar with. You are not completely clear about what this particular constituent of this population or many constituents of this population, which looks much more amorphous. You needed to employ different modalities of classifying, ordering, so on and so forth. And which is why Michel Foucault, when he talks about three important forms of power, the last power that he mentioned was a statistical power, which means all that he was suggesting is that this power of statistics never developed by economics, politics, or such other social sciences, but it developed and arose in the corridors of governmental power, which means that without statistics, you cannot govern. And it is that which becomes a very fundamental understanding point for ethnography, is that why is it that ethnography arose when Europe, within its own geographical limits, had developed more or less, significant ways of dealing with various, uh, you know, contingencies of governance, right? That the governing industry, governing state, governing market, so on and so forth, that they had well sort of developed, you know, technologies of power, modalities of governance, all in place. Uh, what is it that prompted people to pick up ethnography? And it is here that I want to draw your attention to things which are never ethnographic to begin with. In other words, ethnography has often arisen from initiatives and practices which were never meant to be ethnographic by any stretch of imagination. Uh, in other words, what I'm trying to suggest is that one of the things that European transformation, political fortune, industrial achievement, all that it prompted to do, something that we all know, is to constantly not explore its own geographical limits, but also to press against that limits, so that one needs to go beyond what your geographical frontier prescribes. Which, what I want to suggest, is the beginning of discoveries, travels, sea routes, explorations, exploitations, encounters with different civilizations, and more importantly, what does it mean to know about people who are not us but them? In other words, Europe was trying to figure out what a non European looks like. And this was made possible by a number of people who were far from ethnographers, who undertook voyages, who undertook various, travels, travelers, who invented various, discovered various places, uh, went in different directions to reach new territories, new frontiers that they had explored, which is why you had colonialism in India. And colonialism, something that I think all students of social science know, that colonialism is not only about conquest. Colonialism was also about how you actually consolidate your conquest. In other words, how you consolidate your conquest is just not it's momentary, but something which has to be stretched in a manner in which it becomes something of an establishment, something of an enterprise, something of a institutional institutional expansion of sorts, whereby you not only annex territories, but you also develop an order. That order constantly explores the possibilities of knowing the unknowable, knowing what is not intelligible. In other words, one of the things that colonial rule tries to do is to assign sense of legibility to things that are illegible. Because if you do not assign legibility, then you do not govern. Something that Europe had already learned from its own geographies, nation states that it had instituted, and the kind of governance that it had already put in place, whereby it's been realized that if you want to govern, you must make the collective understandable, intelligible, and assign it a sense of legibility, right? And therefore, number of ways in which, for example, I mean, we could focus on India because that's the area with which we are most familiar. That uh, India became a locus for building science, but not in the disciplines of economics, politics, or sociology or anthropology, but simply turn India into a laboratory for experiments of sorts, and thereby gaining constant knowledge about others. Because and therefore it was not merely from the very first day the ethnographers came in. No, they were not there at all. But travelers, artists, photographers, administrators, right? People who were revenue collectors, people who were uh, you know mm, who were people uh, who could document information about certain places. All these different people in their different capacities became very important collectors of information. Therefore, it was not an accident that Marx wrote volumes on India without ever having visited India. He was simply sitting at London, the India Office Library, and accessing volumes that are being written about India, volumes that are being written about also other continents, where there are different people in different capacities. For example, the missionaries, right? uh, they all, in other words, somebody who is part of the government, a government collector or a government district commissioner or a government revenue collector, he is just not there to do only the revenue collection, just to collect revenue in terms of its monetary benefits, but also they are engaged in variety of other things which brought them closer to the both physical realities of the colonized territory and also the social realities of the colonized territory. Because the objective, if you look at, for example, the Battle of Plassey 1757 to 1857, then you'd find that in its entire 100 years, colonial rule was absolutely hell-bent upon turning India, the colonized terrain, into a very effective source of revenue for companies' coffer, right? And therefore, it was no accident that you had the permanent settlement very early on, and that permanent settlement was made possible not simply by having somebody called Lord Cornwallis, who one fine morning decided to have a permanent settlement, but it was preceded by a very well calculated understanding of the topography, landscape, the different geographical areas of this particular territory that they had colonized. And assigning legibility to each segment of that particular territory, right? In other words, what could be few, what could be mm, fertile and what is infertile was something that they were doing only to be able to enact permanent settlement. And therefore, you know it is out of several activities often aimed at realizing revenue, aimed at exploring and exploiting resources, aimed at controlling certain territories, controlling certain segment of a territory, that accounts of people had actually generated, statistical data formulated, so on and so forth. In other words, what I'm saying, that all these different methods of survey, of you know cadastral surveys, map making, cartography, all of these different enterprises are actually the modalities of gaining knowledge, but the knowledge largely contextualized in the domain of governing and producing the imperative of governance, right? And therefore, all these different people that I've mentioned, the missionaries, the collectors, the government, appointed officials, the ICS, the uh, the the people who had drawn pictures. I mean, if you go to Victoria Memorial Hall, I'm sure many of you might have been there. Uh, if you go to Victoria Memorial, there's a Calcutta gallery where you'll find that there are umpty number of drawings done by several artists. Daniel Brothers, Emily Eden, after who the famous Eden Garden has been named. Robert Belno, Fanny Parks, and many people, many artists who came to India, drew pictures of India, which became a very important, you know, documentation, very important part of documentation, that they simply did not, draw or sketch, but they provided an idea of what this country is. They drew a fakir, they drew a beggar, they drew a ceremony, they drew a palace, they drew a king, they drew a lady, a lady who is an aristocratic lady, and they also drew a lady who is a plebeian lady, right? So all this cumulatively produce an idea of what this colonized territory is all about. And what I'm saying is that these were the inspirations in conjunction with which ethnography came as an exploration of the quintessential other. By other, I mean the one that Europe is not, the one that Europe wants to study, the one about which Europe has immense curiosity, right? And this largely form the context within which one has to understand the germinations of what eventually becomes ethnography. Therefore, to begin with, ethnography had developed in very close conjunction with imperatives of colonial governance, right? Because colonial rule, as I said, wanted to turn India into a laboratory of its research, in the sense that they wanted to develop knowledge about India. And this knowledge must flourish in every possible direction. It is not only with respect to the territory, landscape, physical properties, where it is fertile land, where the river is more dangerous, where the river is more contributing to fertility of the soil, so on and so forth, and where it is absolutely infertile. Not only that, but also at what level of evolution, thanks to you know Darwin's Origin of Species, the what level of evolution this country must have been relative to that of the West, relative to that of Europe. And which is why the initial you know, the studies were commissioned by colonial rule, that people were commissioned to undertake very specific research about people, what is the nature of their skull, what is the particular structure of their skull, what is the kind of a forehead that these people have, what the kind of a kind of a gait that these people normally, demonstrate, display. All this became very important inputs, very important constituents of what possibly could ethnography contribute to, right? In other words, one of the things that ethnography started with is to ascertain what sort of a people, at what stage of a development, what stage of an evolution, and how to do that by simply looking at these people in terms of the kind of physiognomy that they have, right? And therefore, it is not an accident that classification became possible of not only the mainland Indian people, but also of those of tribes, people who are supposed to be on the margins, right? Who are the, mainland tribes, who are the mainland people, who are the criminal tribes, who are the cannibals. All these different classification became very important constituent of laboratory making in India. But that laboratory making was for the purpose of governance. Because unless you knew what you were governing, you would not be able to even move a step forward. And therefore, anthropology as a discipline, and it is not, it would be absolutely not something which is, exaggeration to suggest that anthropology grew in close conjunction with colonial imperative of governance. And therefore, all methods that anthropology demonstrate are the methods that grew within the larger necessities of how to manage the empire. They were linked to the question of empire, right? There's a very important book written by Talal Ashad in 1971, which was published by Ithaca Press, London. It's called Anthropology and the Colonial Encounter, which actually outlines this entire enterprise, right? Outlines this entire journey of anthropology in an attempt to perhaps search for his self autonomy, self identity. But the initial questions of anthropology's uh, coming to the limelight would never have been possible if it were not for the colonial rule, the imperatives of colonial rule, right? Last year, 1920, 2022, anthropology celebrated the 100 years of Malinowski's Argonauts of the Western Pacific. Uh, an anthropologist who had studied the riverine community, sorry, not the riverine, sorry, that would be absolutely a mistake. The kind of a, oceanic communities of the Melanesian New Guinea, and he had produced an account way back in 1922. But for anthropology to reach the stage where Malinowski was able to write the Argonauts of the Western Pacific, it was a hell of a long journey, that a hell of a lot of longer path that anthropology traversed before it became anthropology. That it drew heavily on colonialism, drew heavily on the colonial expertise, drew heavily on colonial modalities of doing science, right? In other words, doing knowledge for the sake of governance. That it was only in around 1920s that anthropology gradually started to become a very significant discipline, that it was being taught in the two major universities in England, Oxford and Cambridge, as just beginning of a particular movement which was in the direction of it becoming more and more professionalized and autonomous discipline, right? But it took a longer time. It was not as if one fine morning anthropology suddenly decided that it would become an anthropology, and then ethnography would be its very important research, because it had to wait all this while for all these ethnographers in different capacities, ethnographers as artists, ethnographers as travelers, ethnographers as missionaries, ethnographers as district collectors. All of these, they had to be in place for ethnography and anthropologists to finally make a sense of what their job is, something what their job ought to be. And what was this moment of professionalization and self identification is that they gradually become disciplines to be taught in the higher education institutions such as the universities. Examples are Oxford and Cambridge, because Malinowski is somebody who belonged to Oxford, and also the people who are already there in America, Franz Boas and several others, who are all trying to build on what has already been the colonial foundation, build the prospect and probability of anthropology as a discipline, where two things that they wanted to do in the process of instituting discipline in the universities, formalizing its various modalities of uh, knowledge gaining, uh, modalities of producing knowledge. They wanted to do two very important things. One, that they wanted to develop anthropology as a study of the other, which is Europe's other, something that they had already learned from colonial uh, enterprise. Yet they wanted to found anthropology on a stronger pedestal. What was that? To make it sound value free, to make it appear as value free. Why? Because only by delinking it from the presumptions of colonial governance, the imperatives of colonial governance, the necessities of colonial governance, that they wanted to found anthropology on a slightly stronger footing. In other words, what I'm saying is that they wanted to develop anthropology minus the presumptions of colonial rule. In other words, we would study the native, we would study the primitive, because both native and primitive that they have learned from colonial rule. Why? Because it is only in the context of the modern Europe, the other, the people who are outside of Europe, are considered to be less evolved and thereby native and thereby primitive. That they want to study the primitive, they want to study the native, but not having a kind of a condense, not having a kind of a, uh, condescending attitude which colonial rule had towards the natives. That they would study natives in their own right. They would study natives in as much as what they tell about themselves. How do they perceive themselves? What do they say when they refer to their life? What do they say when they refer to their family? What do they say when they refer to their, you know, uh, market? What do they say when they refer to their state? What do they say when they refer to their governance? All these have to be minutely documented in order to be able to produce an objective account of the native. How does this account become objective? It is by constantly delinking it from the presumptions of colonial rule. That colonial rule had looked at, studied native from the point of view of governing them, from the point of view of ascertaining them what level of evolution that they are, and therefore what sort of civilizational mission that has to be carried out in order to civilize them, in order to make them somewhat the closer to the agenda of um, colonialism, civilization that colonialism stood for. Anthropology, disowning, disavowing all of this by one stroke, wanted to found anthropology and ethnography on a footing which they wanted to call objective, value free, scientific. So, here the question is not to find a definition of science. That is something that we all social scientists constantly suffer from. We try and provide a definition of science, but what I'm trying to suggest, that what methods do is to constantly explore